my daughter turned 2, I found out she wasn't mine. I didn't figure it out by accident. I didn't stumble across a text message or catch my wife in a lie. It was Marcus who told me. And the only reason he told me was because he was drunk, guilty, and apparently tired of carrying a secret that had been eating him alive for 3 years. He called me on a Tuesday evening while I was driving back from a job site in Charlotte. I remember the exact stretch of highway, mile marker 112, because I had to pull over onto the shoulder and sit there with the engine running for almost 20 minutes before I trusted myself to drive again. Marcus and I had been friends since freshman year at Ohio State. We played intramural basketball together. I was a groomsman at his first wedding. He was the best man at mine. My wife Diane had known him just as long, which is the part that should have told me everything long before it actually did. Looking back, there were signs I chose not to read. The way certain conversations would pause when I walked into a room. The way she smiled at her phone sometimes and then set it face down on the counter. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that a man who works 60 hours a week building other people's custom homes deserves a little peace when he gets back to his own. Marcus said it had started 3 summers ago during the stretch when I was managing back-to-back projects down in Savannah and coming home only on weekends. He said it wasn't planned. He said Diane had called him one night because she was lonely and they had dinner and one thing led to another. He said he'd felt sick about it ever since. He said a lot of things on that phone call, actually. Most of them I don't remember now, because somewhere around the 3rd minute my brain went very quiet and very cold and I stopped processing words the way a person normally does. I just let the information land. Then he said the part about Sophie. I told him to stop talking. I told him if he said one more word, I would drive to his apartment in Columbus and put him through his own front door. He stopped talking. I hung up, sat on that highway shoulder with my hazards blinking, and stared at the middle distance until a state trooper tapped on my window and asked if I was all right. I told him I was fine. I was very clearly not fine, but I had enough presence of mind left to know that whatever I was going to do next needed to happen with a clear head, not on the side of I-85 at 9 o'clock at night. I drove home. Diane was in the kitchen when I got there, feeding Sophie the last bites of something orange and pureed that she'd made from scratch, because she was that kind of mother, meticulous and loving, and apparently capable of looking me straight in the eye for 2 years while knowing what she knew. Sophie's face lit up when she saw me. She held her arms out and said, "Daddy," and I picked her up and held her for a long time with my face buried in her hair. She smelled like sweet potato and baby shampoo. She giggled because my beard tickled her cheek. Diane was watching me with an expression I couldn't quite read. She asked if I'd eaten. I said I had. I sat down at the table, and Sophie climbed into my lap, and the 3 of us had the most ordinary Tuesday evening of our lives while I sat there knowing everything had already ended. I didn't sleep that night. Diane went to bed at 10, and I sat in my home office with the lights off and thought very carefully about what came next. I've been in the construction business for 15 years. I manage subcontractors and budgets and timelines and difficult clients who change their minds every week. I know how to plan. I know how to stay 3 steps ahead. The only time in my professional life I'd ever been blindsided was when a supplier in Atlanta went bankrupt mid-project and I had to scramble to source materials in 4 days. I handled that. I handled everything methodically and without panic. This was harder, but the same principles applied. I called my lawyer, Raymond Cho, at 7 the next morning. Raymond is the kind of attorney who does not get surprised by anything and does not waste time on sympathy when there are legal mechanics to discuss. I told him what Marcus had told me. Raymond asked one question. Had I signed Sophie's birth certificate? I had. I was in that delivery room. I cut the cord. I held her while they cleaned her up and she screamed her lungs out, and I was crying, which is something I have done exactly twice in my adult life. Signing that birth certificate was the easiest thing I'd ever done. Raymond said we'd need a DNA test before anything else. He said the results would affect everything from custody arrangements to the question of whether I was legally obligated to continue as Sophie's father regardless of biology. He told me to get tested as soon as possible and to not confront Diane until we had results. He told me not to do anything that would compromise my position. I told him I understood. I scheduled a private paternity test that afternoon through a clinic that handled these situations with discretion. They sent a kit to the house. I collected Sophie's sample during her bath time while she was busy splashing. She thought the cheek swab was hilarious. She kept trying to grab it. I got a sample. I sent it back. The results would take 5 business days. Those were the 5 longest days of my marriage. I watched Diane differently during that stretch. Not with hatred, not yet, but with the particular attention of a man who is trying to reconcile 2 separate images of the same person. The woman who rubbed my shoulders when I came home, exhausted. The woman who cried at the hospital when Sophie had her first ear infection. The woman who had apparently been sleeping with my best friend while I was in Savannah building a retired couple's dream home. Both of those women were real. That was the part I couldn't resolve. The results came back on a Friday afternoon. Sophie was not my biological daughter. I sat with that for about 4 hours. Then I called Marcus back. He answered on the second ring, voice thick with relief that I was calling him, like he'd been waiting for the chance to explain himself more thoroughly. I didn't give him that chance. I told him I had the DNA results. I told him I knew for certain. I told him that the friendship we had built over 20 years was over, and that if he ever contacted me, my wife or Sophie again, I would make sure every person in his professional and personal life knew exactly what kind of man he was. He started to say something about how Diane had told him she and I were basically separated at the time, that she'd said the marriage was falling apart. I told him that was a lie she had told him so he'd feel better about what he was doing, and that he should think about what it meant that he'd chosen to believe it. Then I hung up and called Raymond again. The confrontation with Diane happened that Saturday morning. Sophie was at my mother's house, which I had arranged the day before without Diane knowing why. When Diane came downstairs and found me sitting at the kitchen table with the paternity test printout in front of me, she stopped on the bottom step. She stood very still. She looked at the paper. She looked at me. And then her face did something I had not expected. She didn't look caught. She looked relieved, like she'd been waiting for this conversation the same way a person waits at the edge of a high dive, just wanting it to be over. She sat down across from me. I asked her how long she had known. She said she had suspected from the beginning, but didn't want it to be true. She said the timing lined up with both of us. She said she had told herself it was mine because she wanted it to be mine. She said she loved Sophie. She said she was sorry. I told her that the word sorry existed for mistakes, for accidents, for things you did without thinking. What she had done was not a mistake. A mistake was forgetting to put the trash out on Tuesday. She had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to sleep with a man I trusted, to let me believe her child was mine, to allow me to fall in love with the little girl and build my entire life around her without ever telling me the truth. I told her that was not a mistake. That was a decision. She started to cry. She said she had been so lonely. She said I was always working, always gone, always putting the business first. I told her that I worked those hours so she could teach yoga 3 mornings a week instead of 40, and so Sophie could go to the private preschool she'd already picked out, and so we could live in the house she had personally selected and furnished and decorated exactly the way she wanted it. I told her that loneliness was a conversation, not a justification. She said she knew that. She said she wasn't trying to justify it. She said she just wanted me to understand. I told her I understood perfectly. Then I slid the separation agreement across the table. Raymond had drafted it the night before. What followed was the kind of domestic unraveling that people describe in vague terms when they tell you their marriage ended. The attorney's calls. The spreadsheets. The division of accounts. The house was in my name alone, purchased before we married, which meant she had no claim to it. The construction business was an LLC that my father had helped me establish a decade ago, and Raymond had structured it in a way that made it essentially untouchable in a divorce proceeding. Diane had a part-time yoga income and a joint savings account we'd split down the middle. That was what she was walking away with. Her attorney sent a letter arguing that I had established myself as Sophie's legal father by signing the birth certificate, and that regardless of biology, I owed child support. Raymond confirmed this was likely accurate under Ohio law. I did not argue it. Sophie was 2 years old, and she called me daddy. Whatever else I felt, I was not going to let that become a weapon in a courtroom or a burden she carried someday when she was old enough to understand any of this. I told Raymond to work out a fair number. He raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. Marcus, meanwhile, had clearly been doing some panicked outreach. I started getting calls from mutual friends, people we'd known since college, telling me they'd heard things were rough and asking if I wanted to talk. Two of them mentioned Marcus specifically, said he felt terrible, said he wanted to make things right. I told those friends the same thing I told Marcus. That chapter was closed, not out of drama, not out of ego, but because a man who will look you in the eye at your wedding while sleeping with your fiancé is not a friend. He's a prop. And I had no interest in props anymore. What I did next was probably the part that people would call petty. Raymond would have called it inadvisable. I called it proportional. Marcus ran a financial advisory practice out of a shared office space in Columbus. He had 12 clients, most of them small business owners who had come to him through referrals in our shared social circle, several of which had originally come through me. Over the course of about 2 weeks, I had quiet conversations with 4 of those business owners. I didn't manufacture anything. I didn't lie. I simply told them what Marcus had done and left them to make their own decisions about the character of the man managing their finances. 3 of them moved their accounts within the month. The 4th called Marcus directly and apparently had a very thorough conversation that Marcus later described to a mutual acquaintance as devastating. I didn't feel guilty about that. A man who builds a reputation on trust and then betrays it in the most personal way imaginable should not be surprised when trust becomes a problem professionally. Diane moved into a rental apartment 2 miles away, which made the Sophie arrangements logistically manageable. We had worked out a shared custody schedule that Raymond and her attorney had drafted, and for the most part, Diane respected it. She did not cause scenes. She did not send hostile messages. I think she understood that she had used up whatever goodwill she had, and that the best thing she could do now was behave like a reasonable adult for Sophie's sake. I respected that. I didn't forgive it, but I respected it. The person who caused scenes was Marcus. About 6 weeks after the separation, he showed up at my job site. Not at my house, not at my office, but at a residential project in Dublin where I was overseeing a foundation pour. He pulled up in his car and got out wearing a blazer like he was coming to a meeting. My site foreman, a big guy named Darnell, who had worked with me for 8 years, watched Marcus walk toward me with the particular stillness of a man who has been briefed on the situation and is waiting to see if it becomes his problem. I told Darnell to give us a minute. Marcus stood there on the edge of a construction site in his blazer and his leather shoes, and he said he knew I didn't want to hear it, but he needed to say his piece. He said he hadn't meant for any of it to happen. He said Diane had come to him. He said he was weak and he was wrong and he had been carrying the guilt of it for 3 years. He said he loved Sophie too, that he had been part of her life from the beginning, that it wasn't fair for me to cut off his access to her. That last part was the one that moved me in the wrong direction. I stepped forward until I was close enough that he could see very clearly that I wasn't in a reflective mood. I told him that Sophie was my daughter in every way that the law and I recognized, and that he had forfeited any claim to her the moment he chose to father a child with my wife and then say nothing. I told him that access to Sophie was something that would be determined by courts if he wanted to pursue it, and that he was welcome to hire an attorney and spend the next 3 years of his professional life and whatever was left of his reputation trying to win that argument. I told him that if he set foot on one of my job sites again, I would have him removed by whatever means were necessary and file a restraining order before he made it back to his car. He looked at me for a long moment. There was something in his face, genuine sorrow maybe, or something close to it. I didn't care. Genuine sorrow does not undo 2 years of watching a man love a child he believes is his own. He left. Months passed. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in November, and I took myself out for a steak dinner afterward, alone. Which sounds depressing, but was actually one of the more peaceful meals I'd had in years. I ordered a good bourbon and sat at the bar and watched a college football game and felt, for the first time in a long time, like the air pressure in my chest had normalized. Sophie was doing well. She had started a 4-morning-a-week program at a preschool near my house, and her teachers said she was bright and social and absolutely relentless about being the one who distributed the snacks. I took her to the park on Sunday mornings. I learned to braid her hair, badly at first, and then less badly. She had decided that my old truck was named Gerald, and talked to it when we got in. I did not correct this. I started to feel like something that resembled a life again. Then spring came, and with it a series of phone calls from Diane that started practical and then became something else. The first few were about Sophie's preschool schedule, about a doctor's appointment, about whether I could cover a pickup because Diane had a work commitment. Normal co-parenting logistics. Then the calls started coming at odd hours. Late in the evening, early on weekend mornings. She sounded different. Not hostile, just thin, like something was being stretched to its limit just below the surface. I found out through my mother, who had stayed on reasonable terms with Diane for Sophie's sake, that Marcus had resurfaced in Diane's life. Not romantically, apparently, but persistently. He had convinced himself that he had a right to be present for Sophie, and he had been pressuring Diane to advocate for him. Diane, who had spent years managing competing emotional demands, was caught between a man who felt entitled to the child he had fathered, and a co-parenting arrangement that depended on my goodwill. My mother told me this in the tone she uses when she is conveying information without taking sides, which is a skill she perfected raising 3 sons. I called Raymond. Raymond told me that Marcus, as the biological father, could theoretically petition for parental rights, but that it was an uphill legal battle given that I was the legal father of record, and Sophie had lived with me as her primary parent since the separation. He said it would be lengthy, expensive, and almost certainly damaging for Sophie, and that any judge worth their robe would prioritize stability over biology in a case involving a 2-year-old. He said Marcus would need to demonstrate that he had an established relationship with Sophie, which he did not because I had ensured that. He said bluntly that Marcus was welcome to try and would lose. I appreciated Raymond's bluntness. It was one of his best qualities. The call from Diane came on a Saturday evening in April. Sophie was asleep in the next room. I was reading and not thinking about much of anything when my phone lit up with her name. I answered because it could have been about Sophie. It was not directly about Sophie. She said she needed to tell me something and that she hoped I would hear her out. I said I was listening. She said Marcus had been pressuring her to talk to me, to ask me to allow some kind of supervised visitation arrangement, some way for him to know Sophie. She said she wasn't asking because she thought it was right. She was asking because he was making her life very difficult and she thought if I knew, I could make it stop. I told her I was sorry she was in that position. I meant it. Not as a gift, not as absolution, but because Sophie needed her mother to be stable and functional and not under siege from a man who couldn't accept consequences. Then I told her to hand the phone to Marcus. There was a pause. She said he wasn't there. I told her to call him and conference him in or give him my number. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said okay. 3 minutes later, Marcus was on the line. I told him clearly and without any particular heat that I was aware of his efforts to insert himself into Sophie's life. I told him that I understood the biological reality and that it was a reality I had been living with for 6 months while he was apparently developing retroactive feelings about fatherhood. I told him that Sophie was my daughter, that she slept under my roof, that she told me about her dreams at breakfast and brought me rocks from the playground that she considered gifts. That the word she said when she fell down and needed someone was not his name. I told him that if he filed any legal motion related to Sophie, I would respond with everything Raymond had on the sequence of events from 3 years ago, including the dates, the timeline, and the evidence that he had knowingly continued an affair with my wife through her pregnancy without ever disclosing it to me. I told him that I would not make that information public as long as he stayed out of my life, and that the moment he involved the courts, it became public record. The line was quiet for a long time. Then Marcus said, his voice lower than I'd ever heard it, "You'd really do that?" I told him it wasn't a question of what I'd do. It was a question of what he was choosing to set in motion. He didn't file anything. The calls to Diane stopped. My mother confirmed a few weeks later that he had reportedly taken a position with a firm in Atlanta. I didn't verify it and I didn't care. The geography was his problem. Summer arrived and with it the kind of unscheduled Saturdays that I had not had in years. I took Sophie to the Columbus Zoo. She was catastrophically excited about the giraffes and completely indifferent to the lions, which I found very funny. We got ice cream. She fell asleep in her car seat on the way home with chocolate on her chin and one shoe somehow missing. I met a woman named Carol at a neighborhood cookout that my neighbor hosted in July. She was a pediatric occupational therapist who had moved to the area to be closer to her sister's family. She was funny and direct and had absolutely no interest in pretending that small talk about the weather was interesting. We talked for 2 hours, standing near the same corner of a backyard in the July heat, and I didn't notice the time passing, which had not happened to me in a long time. She asked about Sophie early in the conversation, not tentatively the way some people do, but with genuine curiosity about who she was as a person. I showed her the photo on my phone of Sophie at the zoo with chocolate on her face. Carol laughed and said she had exactly the same expression when she found out something was delightful. We got dinner the following week. It was, after everything, quietly good. I was getting Sophie ready for bed one evening in late August, the two of us doing the particular negotiation that precedes every pajama selection, when the doorbell rang. It was almost 9. Sophie looked at the door with the mild interest of a child who has been almost successfully distracted from the fact that bedtime is happening. I told her to stay put and went to the door. Diane was standing on my porch. She looked the way people look when they have been holding themselves together through a long day and are not holding up very well. Her hair was pulled back in the fast way, not the intentional way. She had a bag over one shoulder that looked like it had been packed quickly. Her eyes were red but dry, the specific look of someone who had already done the crying and was now in the part that comes after. I asked her what was wrong. She said Marcus had reached out to her again before he left for Atlanta. She said the conversation had not gone the way she had hoped. She said she was fine. She just needed to talk to someone, and her sister wasn't answering, and she didn't know who else to call. I stood in my doorway and looked at her for a moment. Then I heard Sophie's feet on the floor behind me, and she appeared at my hip and said, "Mama," with the absolute uncomplicated joy of a 2-year-old who does not know about any of the things that have happened between adults. Diane's face changed completely. She crouched down and held her arms out. Sophie went to her and Diane held her for a long time with her eyes closed. I let them have that. When Sophie was in bed, I made 2 cups of coffee and Diane sat at my kitchen table, the same table where I had placed the paternity test results 8 months before, and she talked for a while about what the last year had been. I listened, not as her husband, not as her enemy, as the other parent of a little girl who was going to need both of us to figure out how to be adults. She was not asking to come back. She was not asking for anything, actually. She was just talking, and after a while, she seemed to feel lighter, the way people do when they've been carrying something alone for too long. When she left, she thanked me at the door. She said she knew she had no right to call me the person she trusted most, and that she understood if I never got there, but that she was grateful I had answered. I told her I hoped things got easier. I closed the door and stood in my quiet house for a minute. Upstairs, Sophie was asleep. Gerald, the truck, was in the driveway. The rocks Sophie had brought home from the playground were lined up on the windowsill in the kitchen, where she had arranged them with tremendous seriousness. The coffee was still warm. I had built other people's dream homes for 15 years, poured their foundations, framed their walls, watched them move in with their furniture and their children and their ideas about what a life was supposed to look like. I was good at the building. I'd always been better at that than at knowing what to fill the rooms with once the structure was standing. I was learning,